Shortage of people waiting for admission. Okay, it's ticked over 2 minutes after 8 p.m. here on the eastern coast of the United States, daylight saving time. So we'll kick it off from here. Welcome to this session, sponsored by Code Pink and Massachusetts, or Mass Peace Action. My name is Marcus Breen. I'm a member of the No Cold War with China working group from Mass Peace Action. And I'm a activist at the very local level, and I'm also engaged in my career as a professor at Boston College. I come to you from the library here, at least virtually. So we're delighted to have Danny Haiphong here with us tonight for this session. Welcome, Danny, and we appreciate the time you put in joining us and in continuing your valuable contribution to this important discussion. And certainly, I think it's fair to say it's certainly escalated beyond being a discussion to being a debate right, between maybe those of us on the in the peace movement, those of us on the left, but not a consolidated left by any means, and then certainly a range of views across a number of different media. So the idea tonight is that I will ask Danny a few questions about a number of topics. We'll probably keep going for a good hour on that format. And then if we get further into the time, we'll continue over the hour. And we will also welcome comments in the chat section, and that'll be monitored by our colleagues in Mass Peace Action and Code Pink. And we will have an opportunity to have Danny respond to those and hopefully be able to close out the evening being, well, I'm sure, not a hopefully, but we'll close out the evening being much more better informed. Let me just say before I say anything else that this time last night I was at a Boston College event, not that I'm here to promote Boston College, but it was a session with a guy called Samuel Moyne from Yale University, who's in the law school at Yale. And he was talking about a book that I think is apropos of our topic tonight. And it's a new book, it's out, I think, and it's called Humane, How the US Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. And I think for those of us in the peace movement, we can see that there's a significant movement to try and understand how we got to where we are today. And part of tonight's session will be to try and extend our knowledge and our understanding of the challenging circumstances in which we find ourselves, particularly given our reliance on media and the information flows. So, Danny, let me just begin by asking you, firstly, what is the major problem with and let's start with the US, with the US coverage of China? What is the major point of contention?
Well, that's a really good question. I first want to thank all of you at Mass Peace Action for having me tonight, and thanks to all who are participating and listening in on this event. So, I think the major problem with US media coverage on China is that it is wedded to the Pentagon and the overall US war machine's designs when it comes to China, its plans when it comes to China. So all of the coverage fits squarely within a new Cold War narrative, which presumes China to be the grand so-called evil in the world. And this fits perfectly into what was declared under the Trump administration first, this great power competition with China, which has turned into this so-called strategic competition that the Biden administration talks about. So all of the coverage that you see in the media, I can just point out a few things that I've noticed just recently, one of which is the numerous articles which have been published by the New York Times and Bloomberg talking about all of the problems that have occurred of late in terms of the US's ability to spy on China. So now the Central Intelligence Agency, as of October 7th, has declared that it is going to focus all of its attention on China. It's closing down so-called mission centers in the DPR, or not in the DPRK, but centering on the DPRK and Iran. And it's going to open 2 new mission centers, one focused squarely on China and how to better spy on China, and 2, how to catch up with China on issues like climate change and global public health and technology and the like. So with this narrative that it's a problem that China cannot be spied on, we see so clearly how the United States and its corporate media, the United States military apparatus and the corporate media, are wedded together. There's a marriage between them to push a dangerous narrative of war against China, which is disastrous given that the United States and China are both nuclear powers. The United States is the only country in the world that has used nuclear weapons on another country. And there is no critical coverage in the US corporate media on how the US is militarizing the entirety of the Asia Pacific, including its own semi-colonies and colonies like Guam and Okinawa, for example, in order to target China. So I think that there is just a huge information gap. There's just no coverage on the United States' role in fueling this new Cold War with China. And then there is this incessant yellow peril, white supremacist jingoism that the corporate media fuels to portray China as the grandest of all evils. What William Burns, the current CIA director under Joe Biden, called the greatest threat to international security and the US's interests at this moment.
Can I just also point out that if we back up a little and engage in a little bit of linguistic work, semiotics, in a sense, what you've also described there is what has been a strong and increasing trend, it seems to me at least, and to many other people, that the military is really determining this behavior. That the idea of how the US responds is not created so much out of domestic policy making. Was that really what you're saying there?
Well, I think it's quite clear that there is a domestic policy aspect to the new Cold War, in the sense that China is constantly scapegoated for the problems that the United States itself has rendered and imposed upon working people in the United States. For example, COVID-19. What have we heard in the corporate media? Just constant blaming of China for COVID-19, the lab leak theory, which has been debunked over and over and over again since April of 2020, but yet it still reemerges because the corporate media has a hugely enamorous love-hate relationship with it. And then there's the fact that the United States' corporate media has basically depicted China as this so-called competitor, which, if allowed to, and we heard the Biden administration say this in late March, if China is allowed to become the wealthiest country, the biggest economy in the world, then there's somehow some kind of threat to American democracy itself, that the United States will somehow have its so-called national security interests endangered. So that's how it has a domestic policy effect, in the sense that the new Cold War both distracts from the real root causes for the economic and social problems that exist in the United States, and at the same time fuels yellow peril racism, which allows the United States' military, as you said, to basically and essentially do whatever it wants. And it justifies these bloated military budgets. They continue to get larger and larger, even though, for example, the United States has supposedly withdrawn from Afghanistan, and the military contractors that have made tens of billions of dollars from that war are so unhappy about that. But there is this guarantee that this new strategy, this new imperial strategy towards China will open up even more markets. We've seen it with Taiwan. Taiwan has received hundreds of millions of dollars, more than billion, more than a billion and a half dollars just in the last 6 to 12 months alone in arms sales with the United States. I mean, this is how dangerous this new Cold War is. And, it really speaks to how profitable and how convenient it is at the same time in terms of its domestic and international implications.
It seems like it can be a perfect storm, can't it? Because you've got the military who get what they want. You've got the long, rather appalling history of racism in the United States that then neatly falls into place in terms of mischaracterizing Asian people as inferior. And then you've got domestic policy. And if we continue on talking about domestic policy a little, I mean, what we have is a very, very large number of people who, since I suppose the Clinton years or just before, have been put out of work, or when they've been re-employed, they've gone into much lower paid jobs and they're really struggling. So the working class have really just had the worst of this. And so it seems to me that also provides a great source of resentment, which of course Trump played into, but that also happily, for those who want to play the game, happily allows a relatively easy enemy to be characterized as an enemy, even though they're not. So China is characterized as an enemy, and unfortunately those people who are suffering, the many millions of them who used to work in the automotive industry, for example, or other factory jobs, no longer have those positions, and they, in typical, perhaps historical fashion, look for an enemy.
Yes, and this is not a new phenomenon. I mean, this is especially in relation to the Chinese, to China, in relation to China. I mean, this has been going on since the mid-19th century, when Chinese laborers in the millions would migrate here and then face this kind of racism, because even segments of the labor movement did this. In San Francisco, for example, target Chinese laborers as the scapegoat for the economic problems that were really caused by big business. And the same is happening now. And this has been, this has been decades in the making, as you said, with the United States deindustrializing by its own necessity, according to the corporate owning class, the capitalist class. China has been the country which has been seen as, well, they took our jobs, right? And that narrative persists to this day. And I think that underlying economic sort of scapegoating has always been there to provide fertile ground for an increase in xenophobia and a real justification for this new Cold War in a moment of crisis, because that's what we're in right now, with the United States being leveled by COVID-19 and then also going through one of the most severe economic crises over the past 100 years. That laid fertile ground for the Trump administration, but the Democrats and Joe Biden now, they haven't countered that any one bit. In fact, Joe Biden and Donald Trump during the 2020 election were sparring for who could be tougher on China. And we've seen with the Biden administration's current policy towards China that he is doing what I've been talking about as what I've been referring to as the Obama version of China policy. The Barack Obama administration talked about wars in a very specific way. So Barack Obama was no peace advocate. He spoke about wars as being divided into two categories: smart wars and dumb wars, and that the way that the Bush administration waged war was stupid. It put the United States in a very bad position globally. And so Barack Obama worked very hard to expand the war machine, but to do it in a way that was palatable for large sections, especially of the US population. Joe Biden is trying to do the same thing when it comes to China, in the sense that he has changed some aspects of the rhetoric. There's no more China virus, quote unquote, coming out of official Washington, at least within the Biden administration. But the policy remains the same in a lot of ways. And there is a lot of recently, what I've been following is this kind of carrot and stick being played in terms of the Biden administration willing to engage in so-called diplomatic talks, while at the same time escalating on key questions like Taiwan, right? So you had a lot of things unraveling at the same time that the Biden administration was supposedly engaged in talks over the past month, whether it's Catherine Tai meeting with the U.S. Trade Representative, meeting with a Chinese envoy, whether it's with Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, having a more peaceful meeting than what happened in that embarrassing interaction with Chinese diplomats in Anchorage, Alaska last March. And all of this has been spurred by the release of Meng Wanzhou, Huawei's CFO, who was released early in October after 3 years of house arrest imposed by the United States in Canada. So I think the real issue here is that the Biden administration has moved its rhetoric to a more smart war kind of orientation toward China, which continues to really reinforce the targeting of China, the scapegoating of China, while at the same time giving it a more professional and politically feasible sort of public relations image. And I think that's very dangerous, given the fact that the Biden administration has been one of the loudest proponents of things like the information war on human rights and the escalations that we're seeing in Taiwan with, the funneling of arms deals, as I mentioned before. All of this, I think, becomes a lot more normal. It becomes a lot less of a crisis when it is spoken about in this more palatable kind of rhetoric, in this more politically diplomatic fashion. I think Joe Biden's administration is looking at this as a long game toward containing China. That's really the goal here.
Well, the containment is an old game. We know that from 70, 80 years ago, the Keenan document, the long telegram. But the question that comes to mind just from your most recent monologue there was, and is, the number of times, you mentioned Biden, and I think it's fair to say, what are we to make of the fact that many people on the left and many people who are Democrats would hope that there would be something that would be different, that there would be a modality that where the peace principle would actually drive something rather than what seems to be something more like conventional American imperial interests. I mean, why is it that the United States, I'm a naturalized American, but born in Australia, but why is it that the United States cannot get out of this habit of doing what Biden is now doing, when I think many people hoped, just over a year ago when we went to the polls, that there might be something at a significantly different register?
Yeah, well, I think that there are many reasons to this, but the core reason for the continuity that we're seeing between Trump and Biden is the fact that the new Cold War is not merely about the political decision making that happens in the minds of U.S. politicians, because there are differences between Trump and Biden. As I said before, there are differences in the way that the strategy is employed, the form that it takes, but the strategy remains the same. And the new Cold War on China is rooted in deep-seated economic interests, geopolitical interests that the United States' political establishment and the corporations, Wall Street, and the military-industrial complex that fuel the political establishment that really do have a stranglehold over it. They're the ones dictating what the United States government, what the Pentagon is doing. they really do see China as a quote unquote threat. So when we hear them talk about the China quote unquote threat, they are speaking for themselves, of course, not telling us the real reasons why, or sometimes they do, but they're not telling us clearly what the real reason for their animosity towards China is. They usually do a lot of projection onto China. China is bad because of X. China is bad because of Y, human rights, because of the South China Sea. You know, there's so many talking points, but at the core of it is a real fear that China will not only become the number one economy in terms of size, but that its economy, because of the form and because of the mode of production that China possesses, will also bring about what the first Cold War was about, which was a fear of socialism. Oh no, socialism is coming, communism is coming. That spells doom for a society rooted in the most the most deep-seated, the most heinous form of inequality that we've seen under the history in the history of this world capitalist system. We're seeing the concentration of wealth come to a point where an example like China, while there are of course rich people and there has been reform and opening up, and that has led to a modicum of inequality, we are also seeing China approach problems that are key to the interests of humanity in a completely different way than how the United States does it. We saw that with the COVID-19 pandemic. China was serious. China mobilized both the citizenry, the masses of people, and state resources to ensure that human life was protected. The United States did the opposite. The United States, has a neoliberal, almost entirely private economy, no public health system to speak of, and essentially corporations allowed, what will be probably 1 million people by the time this thing is over to die, while millions more become impoverished because of it. Meanwhile, China's economy is now growing again, and also tackling key social problems like extreme poverty, which was eliminated in November of 2020. So these are some of the underlying reasons of the US's antipathy, of the fact that it can't get off of this crash course, this trajectory of war with China, because the military industrial complex and the corporations and the corporate interests that are fueling war, they do see China's example as one that must be arrested. I think that there has been an acknowledgement on the ruling class that short of and we see studies like the Rand Corporation seems to have one almost every year, where they talk about the devastating how bad a war would go with China. And they talk about it as like, we need to get better prepared for war with China. It seems like they've been doing one every year since 2016. But there is an acknowledgement that the policy is not really going to succeed, right? China is going to continue to do what it is doing because China has certain advantages over the United States that kind of disallow any kind of change in the historical development in the current course of history of what we're seeing. But there is this caveat of, okay, well, we always have the final solution, so to speak, to turn to. And so I think all of the aggression is really about how does the United States maintain some kind of competitive edge in world politics and the world economy, while at the same time understanding that the clock is ticking and that a decision will have to be made, either to accept number two status. Okay, the United States is not going to be the biggest economy in the world anymore. And with that acceptance, well, how should the United States then position itself? And right now we're seeing with the new Cold War how it wants to position itself. It wants to assert military dominance. It wants to assert hegemony so that it can continue to maintain this mythical dominance that, just like all empires, is destined to fall and destined to fail. And every system has a life course. But the United States has its establishment, those who really dictate policy. They've decided that the only way to arrest that inevitable scenario is to go out kicking and screaming, and to do so in a way that's extremely dangerous, not only because of the nuclear problem, but also, I mean, look at what we just had with COP26. We had the United States, Joe Biden and his administration beating their chest about how they are the ones who are addressing climate change and China isn't, which is a ridiculous assertion given just the pure raw data in what China has been doing versus the United States. The United States funding by tens of billions of dollars annually to fossil fuel corporations, while China has by far more renewable energy capacity than like the next 5 countries combined, including the United States in that. So the reality is clear, but the United States has, with this new Cold War, given a clear message that it will not accept a fall from hegemony without threatening the existence of human life itself on this planet.
It's a very extreme position, and we've seen it before, unfortunately, in the end of World War II and the use of weapons of mass destruction, including as you said earlier, the only use of atomic weapons, and then the firebombing of Dresden and other things. I think actions that really speak to the retribution culture of the United States, retributive justice, in a very extreme form, and it's well and truly institutionalized within the country, sad to say. And, I think it's rather terrifying to think that, a country that has a retributive kind of justice mentality is more than happy to destroy itself or everybody else in the process for a ridiculous principle, which is about being number one. Sorry, it shouldn't work that way. But I wanted to sort of throw a spanner in the works, and I was just looking this up because I know I made a note of it. And that is, while it's pretty clear that the US is going to struggle to stay number one, the Financial Times often has good coverage of China, and the headline that I highlighted for myself as Wall Street's new love affair with China. Now, this is from May this year, but what it points out is that despite all the kind of machinations around what is happening with between the United States and China at a geopolitical level, at a financial and economic level, it's quite the opposite. The amount of funds or the investments into China is astronomical. And this is partly because, of course, those of us who care about gaining a slightly better understanding of Chinese issues will take some time to understand Chinese culture, a great tradition of saving. And so, the great American companies, well, I use great in scare quotes, Goldman Sachs and BlackRock, JP Morgan, are after what is estimated to be about nearly $19 trillion that is available for those companies to help manage. And that's in China. Vast amounts, just trillions and trillions of dollars. And this kind of connection or relationship between financial sectors of the country seems to operate at a completely different level to the ones that you've been talking about. How should we, if you've got any suggestions on this, I'm throwing you a curveball in some respects, how should we manage and understand this incredible contradiction?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think that the left and the anti-war activist community, those who do oppose a new Cold War with China, struggle with this, because it almost seems to indicate that there's some kind of marriage between China and Wall Street. I mean, this is a very popular narrative that says, well, China does business with US corporations and Wall Street, so that means China's bad too, right? Well, what's so interesting about this is that what has basically been admitted, and what you what you put so well, is that China's ascendancy economically, its economic ascendancy, has had real tangible benefits for the vast majority of people. Like, living standards have legitimately risen in China at such a rapid pace that I don't think many people in the United States and the rest of the West and the capitalist world can really wrap their heads around it, because they've been living in 2 generations plus of declining living standards, and this so-called American dream becoming just out of reach, and debt levels rising to an astronomical degree. While in China, it's been quite the opposite, because what China has done, and when I was there in 2019, we spoke to into early 2020, right before the pandemic, the delegation I was on, we spoke to the Beijing Friendship Association. We spoke to Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, folks there. And they said one of the key policies that China put into place to protect itself from neoliberalization was the public control of finance, the state control of finance. And so while there are financial institutions and corporations that invest in China, they cannot manipulate industry or currency in China. And the state holds the vast majority of ownership over how money is spent and how revenue is spent across the board. The People's Bank of China, the central bank, has a lot of power in dictating what exactly gets invested in. So that's why we see, despite all of this investment into China, still you have most people owning their own homes. And you see that, you said the savings culture, disposable income has been rising and rising, because incomes have also been rising as there is this savings culture. I have an American friend who lives in China who talks about this as well, that people save a lot like crazy. And now, because conditions are better, jobs pay more, it's a lot easier to do that as well. So that's a change in China that I think, people have this assumption because of what they're told by the media, especially that those who learned all about China in the 80s and 90s and even the early 2000s, they learned about it as almost like this factory of the world, a huge low-wage labor force, without any understanding of how the government and how the party, the Communist Party, and how the society was dealing with the global economy on a domestic level. And so I think how we can think about this is that China has used private investment, foreign direct investment, as a tool to develop the productive forces and to ensure that China is a wealthy enough society that it can continue to progress in the ways that it dictates in each 5-year plan, and that there's always going to be trade-offs, but in the end goal will be a more prosperous society, a more equal and more egalitarian society, and one that works for the Chinese people. Now, on the other side of this, I think what's really interesting is it reminds me of the trade war, because what you said in terms of all of this investment in China that U.S. corporations and especially U.S. finance, they really like 300 million people who can buy stuff. They like that. They like people who can buy property, who can buy, all the latest gadgets, all the latest technology. That there's very little risk in that. So that's why there is this hesitancy among certain sections. They won't say it out loud, although the Financial Times tends to be the loudest. But the companies, they themselves, they won't say it out. Although Elon Musk kind of came out, because Elon Musk has done very well in China, given the fact that the government literally subsidizes Tesla subsidizes people to be able to buy Tesla vehicles, right? I mean, Elon Musk would be a poor man if it wasn't for China, because China is very invested in electric vehicles. And now And what it's done, whether it's with electric vehicles or, the highest levels of technology that it currently is now leading in, is it used foreign direct investment for technology transfer and the ability to learn from those countries who are more advanced economically, and then to be able to implement that at the domestic level. So it's this real deep contradiction that I don't think that the capitalist class, the ruling elite, however we want to frame, they haven't really figured it out. Because on the one hand, something like the trade war seems so counterproductive, although Biden is still very committed to it, strangely enough. But a lot of U.S. corporations, those in big business, they don't really want to be out in front of that. However, on the military side and on the, on the more jingoistic side, we see really no active protest either. So I think there's always this towing the line when it comes to China, because one of the more advantageous things that China did was reform and opening up, because it integrated China within the world economy. And that is a safety valve in a lot of ways, because China bailed out the world economy in 2008. It bailed it out again in 2020. I mean, this is what we're seeing when it comes to China's role in the world economy. And there is such a stark contradiction, which then really tells a story of how suicidal this new Cold War is, because it does threaten the very economic interests of the United States and Europe, et cetera. And I think it does lead to a lot of contradictions in US policy. But I think the dominant one still, and I think this is unfortunate, I think this speaks to the level of irrationality of the world's imperialist system, this global imperialist system, in the sense that while getting rich and being the dominant hegemon is, of course, the principal goal, there is also this social aspect to it. There's this hegemonic aspect. There's this, it's not all about economics, right? I think people tend to confuse this, is that when it comes to ruling, when it comes to dominating world affairs, it's even more than economics. It's also about the political control necessary to maintain that economic supremacy. And I think that's really what people speak around when they talk about the new Cold War. They don't, that's more difficult, because then it paints more of a picture of conflict that is really happening rather than one of cooperation, which unfortunately there are too many people on the left and anti-war activist circles that want to have this picture that the United States and China are like the same, right? That they have the same interests. It's just that the United States wants to be the best and wants to defeat China. So that's what makes this whole thing bad. But it is about divergent interests in a lot of ways. And that's very important, I think, to note when it comes to all that we're seeing and all that we've seen up until this point.
Great, yeah, great answer. And I think it's fair to say that one of the challenges that we have to, and I'd like to hear you talk about this a little, is the poor representation in the US media generally of these kinds of questions. I cited the Financial Times. It's clearly not a widely read paper in the United States, if any. What we have here is a pretty rationally driven, social media platformized media ecosystem that tends to reproduce a fairly negative worldview, certainly of China, but anything that's not allied with the United States over and over again as negative. And so we have, to all intents and purposes, a propaganda system at work which doesn't allow the breadth of views and the complexity of the relationship between the two countries to actually be comprehended by the populace and by the population. Seems to me it sets up a pretty good set of conditions for keeping fueling, throwing coal on the Cold War, as it were, to make it closer to a hot environment, but certainly the environment of just pointless commentary that always demonizes the other side.
Oh, indeed. I mean, when have we seen the corporate media actually cover things that Xi Jinping says or things that the Chinese foreign ministry says? All of their responses to the information war, all of their responses to US policy. We don't get that in the corporate media. And that's a huge problem because what that automatically says to those listening to the corporate media, those even streaming, even in the independent media, we don't get that side. We don't get that side of the story. And that sends an automatic message that that side of the story is illegitimate. And that part of the information war aspect of the new Cold War is to label and to frame the Chinese perspective as completely illegitimate to the conversation because, the old yellow peril, Orientalist, like racist image of Chinese is, oh, well, they're controlled by a dictatorship, right? The Communist Party of China does not allow any so-called free thought. So we can't believe anything anyone says. And then that lends even more credence to these horrible attacks on CGTN journalists. We saw the Houston consulate get vandalized and closed summer of 2020 in such a horrific way. All of the, even recently in the last couple months, there was a Chinese student who was held for more than a couple of days without like food in an airport in Houston, and then deported back to China, right? All of the closing of the Confucius Institutes, right? All over and over and over again, all of this kind of cultural and information war aspect of this new Cold War just legitimizes this narrative that the Chinese side is illegitimate. And so we not only do we not get it, but even if we did, it's likely that a lot of Americans wouldn't be able to hear it right now. And that's what I think is really dangerous. Yeah. We see the polls, right? The Gallup polls that say that the vast majority of people in the United States have a negative worldview of China, nearly 80%. And during, I think it was like the second, third, I can't even count the waves. They were even during this COVID-19 historical moment, we saw more than half of Americans polling that they believe that China should pay reparations to the world for COVID-19, insinuating that a lot of people do think that COVID-19 not only was first discovered in China, the first cases to be known were in China, but they believe that China is the reason why this problem exists in the first place. And so I think that's I think there's someone in the background, but I think that this is a huge problem. I mean, it's this growing xenophobia, which disallows even the possibility that the Chinese side of the story could be heard and possibly could be a more accurate version of the overall picture of U.S.-China relations at this moment and how they've soured.
There's absolutely no doubt that ignorance is the great enemy, isn't it? And so the failure of the media to provide a better source of information for the American or the non-Chinese or the world public, whatever you want to call it, produces what's been predicted for generations. That is, that ignorance produces bad outcomes. Knowledge produces better outcomes. Knowledge produces truth. And as a former journalist, I can say that it's not an easy job to be a journalist, but it's certainly an important one. And yet, if you read the newspapers in the United States, sometimes I scratch my head and wonder just who, in fact, is educating the people who are journalists, because the way they report on China doesn't seem to comport with what any journalist textbook I've ever seen would suggest. Fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, well, journalism has really just become stenography for war. I mean, the concentration of media in private hands, that has really also fueled the connection between the military-industrial complex and the media. And so we have a situation where major corporate media like Washington Post, New York Times, all of their principal sources are intelligence officials, usually anonymous, And then, on the 24-hour news cycle, you have intelligence officials like John Brennan who have a face, right? Or, we can go down the line in terms of those who kind of are a part of this revolving door between the military and the intelligence institutions and the media. So I think that is really the biggest problem with the information that we're getting, is that it's literally coming directly from those who profit from and who benefit from aggression with China. They benefit from telling the most egregious lies about China. There's no incentive not to, because there's always going to be a job for that. And I think that's what has made any kind of reporting or analysis on China difficult in this moment, is that you are always coming up against these very all-encompassing narratives, right? When the Associated Press comes out with a bogus story, all the major corporate media will run it, no matter how baseless, no matter how much some of us have been railing against these narratives, whether it's like the Uyghur genocide narrative or whatnot for, more than a year now. It will always return, because there are jobs where people are hired to just wait until they're assigned to tell this lie again, because there's a real material interest in doing so. There is no better source of misinformation than the corporate media, and the corporate media sees no better source of their own profit and their own cycle of reproduction than the military-industrial complex, because that continues to grow exponentially every single year with every single budget. So you just have to look in that direction and understand that there will always be reliable points of departure for building a career. And we see it with the proliferation of all these think tanks, the Center for New American Security, and we go down the line, all these think tanks that literally produce these so-called experts who then go into journals and media outlets like Foreign Policy, for example, the rag of the Council on Foreign Relations. Like, that is the reality. We have this real web, right, that all leads to the center of war, of these institutions that all have spun a web together in order to feed off of each other and reproduce these heinous narratives that help reproduce the very agenda that we're speaking about today.
And it seems to me that maybe we're at a moment, and those of us in the Massachusetts Peace Action Group and the Working Group on No Cold War with China, and maybe in association with Code Pink and others, may like to think about producing, I just wrote this note to myself, a sort of no Cold War media literacy handbook, so that we can actually encourage people to pick up the New York Times or pick up whatever newspaper and television show they're watching and say, that might not be a true statement. That is the kind of language that mischaracterizes what's happening. And it goes on all the time. And to illustrate this, I want to suggest that yesterday's quite exciting announcement from Glasgow, which, depending on which media you were reading, was either the US-China climate agreement or the China-US climate agreement, but was a declaration on enhancing climate action in the 2020s. And of course, what's significant about that, and most of the coverage, and I think this was in the first paragraph of every article I read about this, was that it was characterized as a surprise move. In other words, the US couldn't dominate the narrative of that agreement, which basically, for one of the very few times, maybe since Nixon went to China, put China and the US on exactly the same footing. And they had to accept that they were there together as partners. And John Kerry looked quite pained in having to make the statement, and you can go and watch that on YouTube. I'm wondering if that might be the lead into something quite refreshing about some of the coverage. We get a few more surprise moves because it can't be constructed according to what the predictable tropes are, anti-China tropes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what's so interesting about that is that, COP26 began with Biden saying China's not doing enough because China isn't here. Of course,
Right.
They were doing this. They were virtually participating, but, forget that is even more eco-friendly than riding around in motorcades around, Glasgow to attend the session in person. But nonetheless, it started like this. It started very aggressively, right? The United States is saying, we are number one again because we're participating in this. Look at us. And then, I pointed out, and others have pointed out, that it was John Kerry himself in 2019 who wrote an op-ed in December of 2019 about how China, with Ro Khanna, ironically, wrote how, the US can't let China win the green race, as they put it. And they mentioned all of the things that China is doing, right? The legitimate investments in renewable energy, the subsidization of electric vehicles, and the fact that China's really investing a lot in reforestation. That could have, John Kerry had the power really to remind Joe Biden, who was falling asleep at the damn COP26, that, hey, China is actually in the lead here. And, the United States has a long way to go to catch up. So I think what's so interesting about this development is that it does show that there is, despite all the bluster, that there is a new reality in the world, that the Biden administration can go multiple ways with it. It can continue on the aggressive path, which will continue. The new Cold War won't end, so to speak. But also, the Biden administration is now presiding over what could be called a very stagnant, close to a lame duck, at least domestically, administration, where because of all the infodemic and all this stuff about COVID and the vaccine and the economic realities that continue to be very dire in the US, the spending plan disaster, right, that has occurred in Congress, the Biden administration is in trouble. I mean, if it continues to go along like this, we are likely to see the Democrats lose. It's very slim majority in Congress in the midterms, and then possibly lose the presidency in 2024. That's not that's not really a desirable political trajectory to be on. So something like this has somewhat of a save face, because the only option other than doing something like this was to leave with maybe your pride and your hubris intact, but to then leave with nothing, right? At the same time that essentially, we don't really believe the words of a Biden administration in terms of implementing a real climate agenda, given what's happened to the Build Back Better plan, and given that as Joe Biden and his administration was at COP26 talking all this big talk about climate change, he was also pushing the world to pump more oil, including the United States, in order to supposedly get out of this inflation crisis that is really just about rich people and big business trying to recoup all the losses that they incurred over the course of the pandemic, right? Like that. That's wholly contradictory. And even the New York Times had to admit that this is kind of ironic, right? And Biden answered, yeah, it could seem ironic, but we can't get to the point where we want to be with renewable energy and climate change tomorrow, right? Like that's the narrative. It's this constant back and forth. And it just shows how, if Biden, unlike Donald Trump, because Donald Trump doesn't care about official politics, right? Donald doesn't care about Washington, D.C., right? He was doing his own thing in some respects, at least in terms of how he presented himself. Biden, he has a real agenda of doing exactly what he said, building back better, bringing the United States into this position of leadership. You leave COP26 with nothing. What kind of leadership is that? So I think it is very interesting. I don't think it'll change the media coverage on China because I think that there is this new shift to talking about China as being kind of like repressive towards US spy agencies and maybe an ignoring of what China is doing for a little bit because of the US's position. But I do think that it is an interesting development because it speaks to a real a real moment that we are in history, a new reality where the US, it can't really get its way anymore. And we've been seeing this over and over and over again with all of its imperial projects, Syria, Libya. You think the US gets its way, but really what we see is a lot of disaster and chaos and more militarization with very little to show for it other than the militarization, which, as we know, is profitable in and of itself. But it can't be the only, if that becomes the only driving force of US economic development, capitalist development, then the United States is really going to see the acceleration of its decline a lot sooner than I think people, economists, and anyone else who pays attention to this could have predicted.
Well, we know that cooperation is a better way. You don't have to be Einstein to know that that's a better way of living, and we can only do our best to work towards that. I noticed that we're just about up for an hour, and I wanted you to ask one more question, and then we'll go to the questions that folk have posted in the chat, and I'll ask for Cole and Amar's assistance with managing that. I want to ask you about social media. Somebody, I think, from Code Pink put up a note, which for which I thank them, which is to point out that there are, and this is about social media, that there are many alternative and fresh sources of information that are available to us about China and about geopolitics. Here we are on Zoom, is one of them. But also, and this is it, anybody anywhere on the planet can watch this, although I'm not sure that necessarily is that important. But the fact of the matter is that we have remarkable number of vehicles that facilitate human knowledge dissemination, or collection and dissemination of knowledge. CGTN, the Chinese Central Television, has a very good resource. Anybody who follows it on Twitter will know you can set it up and you can watch birds flying across various parts of China if that's what you're playing this today. You can watch bridges being built, crystal clear video, extraordinary, and all via the internet. So you can watch that on Twitter, and you can also watch the videos that they produce on YouTube. And they have, and it's not in Chinese. Most of it that I'm familiar with comes in English. Seem to be European or British and US educated journalists with very good English and producing very interesting material, as well as if you're interested, you can watch party meetings and get reports from party meetings. So I'd be interested in your views of, although we've been a bit dismal and a bit negative and a bit, sort of like critical as to, well, the mainstream media and the corporate media really isn't doing much of a job. Let's be optimistic about these other sources of information for a minute, and then we'll go to the questions from the floor, as it were.
Oh, yeah. Well, no doubt. I mean, one really positive aspect of the new Cold War, if we could call it that, is that it's come in this age of information and so-called globalization where we are really more connected than we've ever have been. And that is one of the more ironic things. I mean, that is true with China to like this nth degree, because China happens to be the most globalized society in the world. China has such deep relationships with the vast majority of countries in the world, including those countries that are calling China an enemy right now. And so there is actually, and there has been ever since July of 2020, when myself and others founded the new Cold War, the No Cold War campaign, and with other projects like the Chow Collective, like Friends of Socialist China, which I co-edit. There's so much work being done, even just in the United States and the Western world. We have expats, we have people like Daniel Dumbrow, people who are living out in China trying to tell real story about China. And then, as you said, there's the media that China has that unfortunately does not get enough attention. But if you've ever been to China, you know that actually the media about China is pretty truthful, and its approach is very positive. And I think it's hard to understand why that's so valuable when you grow up in a culture like the United States, for example, where not only is the corporate media, not only do they hearken on fear, negativity, right? Algorithms that are boosted by dragging people down and dragging society down, really, to dragging us as a collective down into this real narcissism and nihilism, right? I think that culture that's reinforced by the corporate media and its social media and institutions like that, it just isn't the same when it comes to China. I mean, the media that comes out of China is very positive. It mainly focuses on what is China doing. You said building bridges. It'll talk about things like its international relationships, the Belt and Road Initiative, what China is helping build in places like Laos, high-speed rail, things like that. It'll talk about political documents. What is Xi Jinping saying? What are the foreign ministry saying about key problems? I mean, it really does have it's a different feel because it's not corporate media. I mean, the US calls it state affiliated media because, a country like China doesn't allow, big private companies to own media in China. Like, that's just not allowed. Just like most rational societies that I know of today, Cuba, for example, they don't allow this corporate media scene, this monopoly of the media. They don't allow profit to drive the media because that's a disaster. And we've seen the misinformation crisis that the United States and the West is into is full proof of that disaster. So there is a lot of positive work happening. I mean, in the last couple of years, I myself, but I know many colleagues of mine who've been able to build real genuine relationships with people in China, with those who are doing very similar work to us. They just happen to be, on the other side of the world. So, yeah, a big shout out to people like Jingjing Li, for example, who does work at CGTN, but she also is a vlogger and does her own thing. And she's trying to also expose Western audiences. She's not talking to Chinese people about this because Chinese people kind of know about their society, but she's trying to show Western audiences and the US in particular that, look, China is not evil. You can travel around. She's traveling around Tibet. She's going to Xinjang. You can travel. You can show what life is like. And it's not some draconian nightmare like the US media tells us. So there is a lot of positive going on because I think there is a real urgency around this among those who are serious and who are not taken by this xenophobia and this anti-communism and all of that. There's an urgency around this question. People that I would have never expected to speak out about this issue are now starting to come out, and I think there is a lot of positive collaboration, solidarity that can be built. I'm hoping that we can do more traveling, that we can do more eyewitness reports, that we can build more genuine relationships with the people and the institutions and those out in China and the rest of the world who really do want peace. So I am actually enthusiastic, also from the standpoint of, as we've been talking today, this agenda that the United States has, it's a failing one. It's not one that has any kind of potential for quote unquote success. The United States is an empire in decline, and that can't be reversed. There is no putting back together the pieces because it's out of gas, ironically. So despite pumping all sorts of gas, right? Like it's literally out of gas.
It's history, isn't it? It's history.
Yeah, it really is history. And so I think that's so important to remember, because that does lend to more opportunities with the urgency that even if it's not a majority, right? I think people think we need like everybody to be on our side. No, we just need people who are invested enough to make this a serious part of our peace movement.
Right. I have to say that one of the things that's important about the opportunity, or that comes as a result of visiting China, is really just to appreciate the dimensions of the country, and not only the richness of their local media environment, but the dimensions of the country. I was there doing a research project a couple of years ago, and I visited the producers, several media companies are producers of a very popular historical TV show. I think it's called The Palace. And they were talking to me, you can watch it on YouTube, and they were talking to me about their audience. And we said, oh yes, what's your audience? And of course, people here talk about Rachel Maddow in the United States, MSNBC, she might have, but on a good night, 1 million viewers. And they were talking about people sitting down to watch this show on a regular basis, numbering 800 million. Now, this is 800 million people watching at one moment, or one time, a television show about the history of China. The numbers are remarkable. And I think this is, if we could just finish on this, Danny, I mean, this is just getting our heads around the simple facts of China are partly a part of the challenge.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, when I was in China, people would not talk about, a lot of people were not talking about it as a country. It's like, you don't think of China as a country, think as a civilization. Think of it as, it's a huge place. It's in one region of China is so different from another, but yet I think one thing that I think is shocking is that there's a lot of unity, right? I think ever since the revolution of 1949, unity was such a key point. People think, it's all about, peasants and workers taking over and they just like abolished all the bad things. It's like, no, there was actually a lot of emphasis on national unity because that was the only way for China to come out of what really was a century of humiliation. And there's a lot of spirit around that. I mean, I think a lot of people that I met there were just like, we aren't going back to that, so forget about it, right? Like that there's really is unity, right? There's like all of the diversity, 50 plus ethnic groups, regions that don't, you go one, I was in Beijing, then you go all the way west and it's like, doesn't look the same, but there's also a lot of unity. And now there's a lot of continuity and development. And to wrap your head around that is hard because as we know in the United States, there really isn't a lot of continuity in many areas anywhere, right? Whether we're talking about economic development, whether we're talking about social development, there's a lot of segregation. There's a lot of, the rural urban divide, the race divides. There's so much it's kind of, it's a chaotic society and it's one driven by the so-called free market. It's driven, but in China, it's like, you have this, you kind of like have a basket of almost everything. And I think that's what makes the society so rich right now. Not rich as in wealth, but rich as in, having this stability and having so many points, so many advantages, I think, that really lend itself to this current moment where you need both unity and you also need a respect for the true diversity of not just Chinese society, not just China, but also of the world. You need to both unite on things that that are of interest to us all, and also respect the sovereignty and the diversity of people all over the world, nations all over the world, that even if they have a similar history, they speak a different language. They, have a different experience. They, there's just so much that we can learn, I think, from that. But wrapping your head around it, I think, I was only there for 2.5 weeks. I want to go for longer because to understand China, you have to really be deeply, intensively studying China and experiencing it. I think you have to experience it for yourself. And also understand that, no one in China romanticizes anything. Like there's a lot of realness. There's like a real vision of hope, but there's also like, yeah, man, things are hard in the world right now. And, I think China, we have luckily a big major power that cares about that part of the world situation. And it's really about us getting on board, getting our forces on board for what is an immensely challenging, but also I think it will be humanity shaking and earth shattering, in the sense that it holds so much potential for the future. Like there is a lot of potential to resolve the issues that we face, and to really build a better world for generations to come, so long as we're prepared to fight for it.
All right, well, beautifully said. And thank you for that summing up on a wonderfully optimistic note, if I may say so. I think those of us in the peace movement, it doesn't matter how old or young we are, or where we are, I think we'd all agree that what we want is a peaceful world, coexistence, and an opportunity to share and enjoy the multiple cultures of the world, and to grow as human beings in the process. So thank you once again, Danny, for this. We've got now a few questions that have been posted, and a few other things that we may be able to do here. Cole, I don't know what the best way to do here. The best thing to do, I can certainly point to a comment which might take us back to reality a little, from David Keppel here. David, I see your question about a novel by retired Admiral James Stavridis. I don't know if we really want to talk about a retired admiral. Has he got anything useful to say? But let's give it a go, David. And he talks about nuclear war with China. And David asks, can we give a critique of its scenarios? I've already somewhat demonized the retired admiral, but you want to comment on the way this kind of this entire sort of warish literature plays out here, Danny?
Could you repeat the question? Sorry, I missed the first half.
A novel called 2034 by retired Admiral James Stavridis on a nuclear war with China. And David wants to know whether or not you can give a critique of its scenarios.
No, unfortunately, I've not read that one, but I'm sure it's not a good book. Yeah, sorry about that.
I'm sorry, David, that may not be very helpful in answering your question. I see you smiling there and waving. Thank you for your understanding. I think it's fair to say, I'm a media academic, I think it's fair to say that there is a huge sub-industry of anti-Chinese material, not only in the media, but in the publishing industry, the TV industry, the film industry.
Yeah.
It's a massive flow of information that characterizes the Chinese and any non-American interests, really, in a very negative way. I mean, we're not only talking about Sylvester Stallone in Vietnam, and the peculiarities of that kind of racism, but an entire system.
Yes. No, it's so true. And, and it extends everywhere. I mean, there's now a lot of focus, surprise, surprise, on Hollywood now, right? There's a lot of this jingoism about China's relationship with Hollywood and the entertainment industry. And that has become a source of lucrative opportunities to bash China and to get book deals and whatnot, because I mean, it's no surprise. I think wherever the military industrial complex is involved, there will be those who, can make a good career, whether it's writing books or whether it's becoming, think tank analysts, whether it's becoming, so-called cultural critics. Like, I mean, there's just, it goes on and on and on in terms of the opportunities that are opened up. I mean, it's kind of like a new media industry, and it's likely to get worse before it gets better. That's for sure.
Yeah, sure. I see David's raised his hand. David, I'm sorry, I'm going to just.
Oh, well, yeah, I was just going to say if you can get hold of the book without parting with too much money for a public library copy or something, it's probably worth doing, because Stavridis is close to Hillary Clinton. So it's very much an establishment publication, but it is quite critical of US policy. And it is pointing out how the so-called freedom of navigation patrols in the South China Sea could easily lead into a nuclear conflict. For whatever it's worth, and there are some obvious things wrong with it that will hit you as soon as you read it, it still is it's good that someone as much part of the establishment as that is at least raising some questions. And I was talking with my senator the other day, who's a Republican, Todd Young of Indiana, and he had actually read a third of it. I told him to finish the book. But,
nice. Thanks, well, you've piqued my interest, so thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I can draw your attention to another topic, and this is a really tricky one, and of course it provides a great solace to those people who are opposed to China, and that is from Raj Jashnani, who is interested in the Chinese interaction with its territories. So Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tibet, India, the sort of regional powers, but also and the territories. This would take another couple of hours to address effectively, but Danny, I think just if you could quickly summarize, the kind of negative coverage of much of this, if you wouldn't mind. I hope I'm not leading you too far into the direction that I'm interested in, but I'd be interested in what you have to say.
Yeah, well, I think this is a big part of the information war. It's the propaganda war. The United States, this has been going on for decades. This has really been going on since, if we put Taiwan into there, it's been going on since the revolution in 1949, right? This kind of attempt to divide China. It used to be, after the revolution of 1949, an attempt to really divide China, to actually acknowledge that mainland China was no longer the rightful government of China because of that revolution. And, the United States almost went into a nuclear war because of that so-called Taiwan Straits crisis. But, in the more modern period, the more modern sort of US-China relations, era of US-China relations, issues like Tibet, issues like Xinjang, issues like Hong Kong, they all fit within what I think is a very convenient overall narrative that's driven by US intelligence in a lot of ways, of course, because we know that the forces that are supported in, whether it's in the region, but usually it's outside of the region, because a lot of the impetus for this narrative, a lot of the material basis of it comes from the outside, whether we're talking about like the Free Tibet student movement, which mainly resides in the United States and is funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, whether we're talking about the Dalai Lama himself, who does not live in China. His crew, the Lamas, they ran away to India and have not returned. They were funded by the CIA to do that, and they were protected by the United States in their journey out after they were given arms, and that they were hiding in monasteries to try to undo the progress that was made after 1951 and then finally liberation 1959 from what was really serfdom in Tibet. In Hong Kong, all through 2019 and into 2020, the United States was funding directly and coordinating with forces like Jimmy Lai and Joshua Wong and others, Nathan Law, right? All connected to the Democrat Party and other organizations funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which, for those who don't know, is an outgrowth of the CIA and literally was founded in the 1980s to do what the CIA did in secret in public, because CIA operations happen to be very ugly and heinous and violent, and so the United States no longer wanted that as its principal image around the world, as a principal part of its foreign policy. So the NED kind of gives it this so-called democracy veneer, and a lot of congressional dollars are funneled into it to hype up these campaigns. And it all falls within the framework of the human rights narrative, this like human rights industrial complex. It's all about framing China, although almost nearly, all of the accusations are baseless. But the point is not the accusations or whether they're true or not. The point is that it's all about painting a picture of China, which demonstrates to especially liberals. I think it's mainly targeted at liberals, although it's effective across the political spectrum. But I think American liberals, liberals in the West, even social democrats, people who consider themselves left of liberal, these human rights narratives are very attractive because, well, the United States happens to be a shop of horrors when it comes to human rights. Like it's a catastrophe. And so it feels natural to just associate the very same issues that the US faces with China, without doing any investigation or understanding anything about the internal politics, contradictions, and ways of living and the society at large in China. So, in sum, really what we see, I think, with all of these questions is an attempt to divide China. I think at the end of the day, if you were to ask a US strategist, well, really, what's the real politic? What's the real reason for all this? Well, it's like, well, in the best case scenario, and there have been admissions to this, it would be great if Xinjang became East Turkestan, for example, or if Hong Kong suddenly had less of a relationship, suddenly became this kind of like independent, like not just one country, two systems, but potentially even further independent from China. Taiwan, we see the separatist agenda there quite clearly, because the current president, which Tsai Ing-wen, who receives all of these arms sales, says straight up that Taiwan is a country for the first, this is like news to much of the world for the last 6 decades, but 7 decades. But that's her and her party's political agenda, is to get closer to the United States and push this very strange, very historically not only inaccurate, but also very counterproductive narrative of Taiwan independence, and Tibet, a similar thing. And I think what we're going to see, and so I'll just end it here, closer to the Beijing 2022 Olympics, as we've seen with like Enes Kanter, for those of you who are actually in Boston, please call the Boston Celtics and tell them to cut him. But as we've seen, like, even though the corporate media is kind of, they're a little more hesitant around the human rights questions right now because they have been so thoroughly discredited. I think we're going to see them ramp up again. We've seen the Enes Kanter situation, because the 2022 Olympics are going to be a real hot spot for the United States. China's going to look very, very, very good because, first of all, China has COVID contained, its economy is growing, and it has a real strategy and plan. And China's a little bit different from other economies, Brazil, or, it's not going to have the same detrimental impact as it would in other places. So that's going to be a real source of anxiety. I think we're going to see the corporate media get really anxious about this particular event, and it'll bring up, I think, the Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, all of it will come up and become recycled over and over and over again. So we can be reminded that we should oppose Beijing's capacity to hold the Olympics, that it's this evil country that should not be doing this. It shouldn't have any kind of leadership in this way. So I think that's what I'll end there with that question.
Okay, well, I think it's again a valuable prediction that you've made, and for all of us who are watching and who are listening to your valuable insights. I think it's also a way of helping us to better prepare for the relatively ceaseless flow of information that doesn't really intend to inform us, but more importantly, to the work of No Cold War, Mass Peace Action, Code Pink, and others in the peace movement, I mean, to be able to read the misinformation we're given so that we can pursue our objectives of a more peaceful world and better collaboration across the planet, then I think we'll be doing both ourselves a favor, as it were, but also the United States a favor in perhaps redirecting its interests and its energy towards some of the objectives that it crows so much about. I think that we are pretty much, yes, we are pretty much out of time, and I think that Danny has pretty much wound up his comments. If there's anything you'd like to say for a minute or so, Danny, we can give you the floor again. Otherwise, we'll say bid you adieu.
No, well, I just want to thank all of you for attending. Thank you all so much, Mass Peace Action, for hosting this. And, I do want to plug a few things if possible. Friends of Socialist China, please do follow the website, follow social media if you can. We're actually preparing, a month from today, a Socialist Democracy Summit, because the Biden administration is going to be holding a democracy summit where it's excluded China, Russia, of course, all the socialist countries. And so we're going to be doing a counter summit on that. And we have some very, interesting folks, representatives from China, Vietnam, and other places to speak on socialist democracy and to speak on the danger of this universalization of Western democracy, which I think is one of a big reason, a big problem for the world today and the peace movement, especially. And then, just catch me at Black Agenda Report each week. I'm doing a lot of work, podcasting work on the Left Lens YouTube channel, so go check that out. And if you can't support my work, I'm doing this journalism independently, funding free. So patreon.com/Danny Haiphong, if you can support that, that would be great. But yeah, much appreciated to all of you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, and thanks again for spending time with us and for sharing your information and insights, and in the cause of peace and unity. And I think now it's up to me to thank everybody as well for being here and for participating in this, for your questions and your contributions. And until next time, we'll say goodbye and thanks again.